Hello, true duelists. It's YGO Strat's Yu-Gi-Oh! Single Card History, where I'm talking about some of the cards that have impacted Yu-Gi-Oh! Throughout the years, and some of the other ones that did not. Today's card, the intended way to play fusion cards and a template for card design in and of itself, Polymerization. Polymerization was first released as a super rare in the Legend of Blue Eyes pack in 2002, with countless reprints to date. Some notable ones include Dark Beginning 1 as a common in 2004, a Shatter Foil rare in Star Pack Arc 5 in 2015, a secret rare printing in the Legendary Collection Kaiba Mega Pack in 2018, Premium Gold rare in Maximum Gold 2020, and Dual Terminal Ultra Parallel rare in Hidden Arsenal Chapter 1 in 2022. As of this video, it has spent no time on the ban list. And honestly, I'm gonna say it never will at any point ever. It's just Poly. A normal spell card, its effect reads: Fusion summon one fusion monster from your extra deck using monsters from your hand or field as fusion material. Polymerization is one of the oldest cards in the game, being printed in the first ever set, and this is completely irrelevant, but its original printing has some of my favorite card text in the entirety of the game, because it reads, fuses two or more fusion material monsters to form a new fusion monster. That means nothing. None of that can tell a new player what to do when you use this card, and that to me is the pinnacle of 2002 Yu-Gi-Oh! Just throwing cards on the field, declaring card effects, and having your cards confiscated by the teacher during recess for causing too many problems. In terms of the actual use of the card, Polymerization is notable for setting the template of how fusion spells would function. Plenty of decks and archetypes have their own fusion spell, and the majority of them will have this same effect as this card, allowing you to send fusion materials from your hand or fields to the graveyard in order to fusion summon. That is the standard for fusion summoning, plain and simple. This is somewhat interesting compared to the other summoning mechanics in Yu-Gi-Oh! There are absolutely generic cards in regards to things like Synchro or Xyz or Link monsters, and most every card type has generic support for those cards. But Polymerization is a card that can be used to summon, let's say, 90% of fusion monsters in the game, not counting, contact fusion monsters or cards like the evil heroes that specify they need dark fusion specifically or something to that effect. This technically means that all fusions have been designed with this card in mind in some capacity. I very much doubt that anyone has ever fusion summoned a Shadal monster using vanilla Polymerization, but you could. Modern fusion decks more often than not get their own special fusion card. From what I can remember, that started with Shadal Fusion, which not only allowed players to use it like regular Polymerization to send cards from hand or field to the grave, but also broke the floodgates of powerful fusion spells by enabling players to fusion summon from the deck as well. But not all fusion decks get this treatment. Elemental Heroes, a deck known in part for its large quantity of fusion monsters, does not have its own Polymerization per se, instead getting a card called Miracle Fusion. Miracle Fusion has the same end result as Polymerization, but whereas Poly fusion summoned by using materials from hand or fields to the graveyard, Miracle Fusion instead banishes the materials from the field or graveyard instead. Plenty of other fusion decks have got their own Miracle Fusion counterpart, including the likes of Frightfur Fusion or the generic Dragon support Dragon's Mirror. Konami has gotten pretty creative with their fusion spells over the years to help make them more desirable or competitive as the game grows and changes. Rocket's got a quick play fusion spell card that destroys the materials instead of sending them to the graveyard. Shadal's got an equip spell card that allowed them to fusion summon, and plenty of traps have been printed to help fuse on the opponent's turn for decks that aren't as lucky as, say, Shadal's or Metal Foes who have quick play fusion spells. Still, neat as the growth of fusion spells and cards to fusion summon have been, those aren't Polymerization. For all the time that's passed, a number of decks do still play and even have the means to search the classic fusion spell out. Frightfur Patchwork is a powerful spell that can give players a free +1 by itself, adding not only a Polymerization from deck to hand, but any Edge Imp monster as well, and it greatly helps Fluffles as a deck. Hell, that card even briefly saw play in some branded decks to some level of meta success. Predaplant have Darlingtonia Cobra that can search Polymerization, and Elemental Heroes have things like Woodsman, which is a card that exists and can search or or even recover a used Polymerization from the grave or add one from deck to hand. There's even generic fusion support that searches Polymerization, with things like King of the Swamp, Fusion Recycling Plant, Fusion Sage is an old-ass one, and modern hero decks will play cards like Vision Hero Vion to search Polymerization. And there's even Fusion Substitute, a card that's treated as Polymerization at all points, and only allows you to fusion summon by sending monsters on the field to the grave. But trade off for that, it allows itself to be banished from the grave to return a fusion monster from grave to extra deck so as to draw cards and get more advantage. This hasn't seen wide play historically, but for one format, this was the key piece to one of the best decks to date, namely Fusion Substitute Zodiac, an insanely consistent and powerful deck that was able to abuse Luna Light Black Sheep, a card printed to help Luna Light serve as a generic fusion deck, able to search out a fusion substitute and use its grave effect to recycle Norden and draw an extra 4 or so cards in the ideal turn 1 if I'm not mistaken, all from a piece of support to the generic Polymerization engines in this game. Truthfully, this card's a bit of a tough one for me to cover like I do other ones in this series, so I apologize if I've been a little all over the place in my script here. Polymerization is one of the most niche but also generic cards I can think of. Despite being one of the more iconic cards in the game, or even series you could argue, it took quite a while to see play in any amount of competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! In regard to most fusion decks, they didn't see top level play through Polymerization until like the mid-2010s, despite this card having existed since 2002. That's not because there were no fusion monsters worth playing, but it's because Polymerization is one of the worst ways to make them. Polymerization requires you to draw Polymerization itself and the minimum 2 monsters to use as fusion material to make your one fusion monster. Without other effects, this is a neg-2 an advantage, and if your fusion monsters need specific monsters, it's a neg-2 that's easy to brick on. Compare this to a card like, say, Metamorphosis, that could just trade one monster for another, materials be damned except for the levels, or a card like Cyberstein that, while having a large cost, could get you a big beater for free without needing to draw multiple specific cards. This was a problem throughout the early 2000s and even the early 2010s that most good fusion decks had to ignore in order to be good. And when you look at making fusion decks that did well, you'll see either things like Cyber Dragon using cards like Future Fusion and Overload Fusion to cheat out their boss monsters, heroes with the likes of Miracle Fusion, or just straight up things like Gladiator Beast, which foregoed Polymerization entirely in order to do discount synchro summoning before the year of 2008. It wasn't until 2 things changed that Polymerization became viable in certain strategies. The first was the inclusion of good generic searchers for it. Things like King of the Swamp generically, or the cards like Luna Light Black Sheep or Fluffle Owl to allow players to get it from deck to hand more consistently. This meant accessing it became not only easier but more reliable. And the second, and in my opinion far more important change, was the way Konami designed fusion monsters. Starting, I believe, technically with heroes, but especially once Duelist Alliance shook up the game, fusion decks started to require more and more generic materials for their summons. Any Shadal and any light monster is a lot easier to get to than exactly Elemental Heroes Avian and Burstinatrix, or just any 2 Luna Lights, or any Edge Imp and any Fluffle monster. The rise of generic materials and fusion monsters in these archetypes has made Poly a much more playable card, and is really the key to keeping it viable in any sense, be it a competitive one or even realistically, even just casually. The fact of the matter is, classic Polymerization is too inconsistent to be good all on its own. There's plenty of other decks I'm sure I've missed in this video, like Prank Kids or Ancient Gears, which have fusion monsters to abuse, and I could mention cards like Mud Dragon of the Swamp or Garura, the Wings of the Resonant Life, which technically let any deck play Polymerization, but those cards aren't really good for Poly. It's more specifically that super one that people love to complain about. So it doesn't feel too relevant, and in terms of the decks that I've missed, well, there are more decks with fusion strategies than are worth mentioning in what is supposed to be a roughly 10-minute video on the history of one card. Overall, Polymerization is one of the oldest and, in my opinion, most iconic cards in the game, from being the base of design in the majority of fusion strategies, and even setting the standard for what a fusion spell's art will look like. It's a card that set the tone for an entire summoning mechanic, and And while it's not the best fusion spell in the game, Konami has shown that it is one that will continue to see support in future decks as more cards and engines are printed that use this one specifically for fusion plays. And so that's our look at Yu-Gi-Oh! Single card history, Polymerization. Stay tuned for our next video, and feel free to suggest some cards to review or what type of video you'd like to see. Don't forget to like, and as always, subscribe to YGO Strats so you too can become a true duelist.